Let's start with terminal marks. We use a period to end a sentence that makes a statement or conveys an action. In the grammar biz, we call these declarative sentences. So these are the sentences that we've been learning about in this course primarily. But we also use terminal marks to end sentences that make a request or issue a command. These are often called imperative sentences. And of course, we use terminal marks after direct questions. Now, this is a bit of a weird one, but you will likely run into it at some point. We keep the question mark at the end of a sentence included within another sentence. So, for example, how can the two men be reconciled? Question mark was on everyone's mind. We use a period after abbreviations, and there are all sorts of abbreviations. So be aware that there may be style considerations involved in this. So depending upon the style guide that you're following, there may be periods or there may not be periods. So for example, AM and PM, that's a great example. There's a number of different ways to convey this concept, and it matters which style guide you're following. Use a period after a polite request. Now, this might not be initially obvious. So, would you mind shutting the door? Will the audience please stand? Neither of these questions are actual questions. These are polite ways of saying things so that you don't sound like you're ordering people around. So instead of saying shut the door, you're saying, would you mind shutting the door? You're actually telling the person to shut the door. You're not actually wondering if they would mind or not. You're asking them to shut the door. You're just saying it politely. And the same thing goes for will the audience please stand. There's not really a question there. You're asking the audience to stand, but you're saying it politely. Use a period after an indirect question. This can get writers, and it gets me sometimes as well. I'll sit there and wonder, is that actually a question? No, it isn't. I have often wondered why some people don't like raisins in their cinnamon buns. Now, I might be alone in this, but this is not an actual question, right? I am pondering this in my head. So I'm not asking a direct question. I'm thinking about this question, which is different than asking a question. And the same goes for the next example. Plimpton was thoughtful enough to ask whether we had eaten. This sentence doesn't say, Plimpton asked, comma, have you eaten? Question mark. That's not what this sentence says. This sentence is talking about Plimpton asking whether we have eaten. And that's different than directly asking, have you eaten? One more. Use an exclamation mark after an expression of strong feeling, but use it sparingly. So I think that we get used to, in texting and in social media, of using a lot of exclamation marks. Exclamation marks are a way that you can express yourself. And in that kind of communication, which is very much direct with your audience, maybe you're bantering back and forth in that sort of communication, it makes sense that you need more ways to express yourself. That's why we use emojis in social media posts, and we use it in text as well. It makes sense. It's almost, when we communicate through social media, it's almost a hybrid between written and spoken communication. So it's got its own set of rules and conventions. But when you are writing professionally, that's a whole different kettle of fish. Your words should speak for themselves. And so you don't want to overuse exclamation marks. exclamation marks come off as a bit trite. They have a feeling of being a bit lazy on the part of the writer if you overuse them in professional communication. And they don't tend to look terribly professional. So make sure that you're very careful when you use exclamation marks in professional writing. Use them very sparingly. Let's move on to semicolons. Now, lots of people have trouble with semicolons. Some people won't even touch semicolons. But now that you know the difference between a dependent and an independent clause, you know what? Semicolons are going to just be super easy. And we've already talked about them anyway, so it's going to be a piece of cake. So you've seen this kind of a list of various ways to write out two different sentences. You might write, Wade held the ball for an instant, period. He passed it to Wes, period. Now, both of these are sentences. That means they are independent clauses. What's an independent clause? An independent clause is a clause that contains a subject and a verb. But that's all clauses. So whether it's dependent or independent, you have a subject and you have a verb, right? So what makes independent clauses different than dependent clauses? Well, independent clauses also make sense on their own. So Wade held the ball for an instant. That makes sense on its own. We could stop there and we're done. Or we could write, he passed it to Wes. He passed it to Wes. Makes sense on its own. We can put a period at the end of that and we're done. Now, a lot of times we want to connect two ideas together, particularly when they're closely related. It can also be good for transitions, so helping our writing flow. So we might connect two independent clauses together with a coordinating conjunction. Remember that, fanboys? For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Those are coordinating conjunctions. So when we put two independent clauses together with a coordinating conjunction, we make sure we don't forget that comma. Or we can put those two independent clauses together with a semicolon. Or we can put those two independent clauses together with one of those connecting words, one of those conjunctive adverbs, one of those words that helps that transition. So Wade held the ball for an instant, semicolon, then, comma, he passed it to Wes. So the key here is that you must only ever use a semicolon to connect two independent clauses. They must be independent. Okay? Now, of course, there are exceptions because that's what we deal with in grammar. However, this is the most common use of semicolons. So remember that, because this is 99% of the semicolons you're ever going to use. Now, here's the exception. Use a semicolon to separate coordinate elements that are joined by a coordinating conjunction, but that are internally punctuated. So, his tour included concert appearances in Medicine Hat, Alberta, semicolon. Regina, Saskatchewan, semicolon. Winnipeg, Manitoba, semicolon, and Kamloops, BC. So what are we doing here? Well, we have these 4 elements. Medicine Hat, Alberta, that's one. Regina, Saskatchewan, that's another. Winnipeg, Manitoba, that's a third. And Kamloops, BC, that's a fourth. So we have 4 elements to this list. But we need that internal punctuation within each element so that it's not just a bunch of mangled words. If we didn't have a comma between Medicine Hat and Alberta, it would be really hard to kind of tell what's going on. And it Alternatively, if we just had a whole bunch of commas and no semicolons, it would also be hard to tell what was going on because it would feel like we had 8 elements instead of 4. So we can think of the semicolon in this case acting as a harder form of punctuation than the comma. We use the comma to separate the information about the element from the element, and then we use the semicolon to separate each of the elements within the list.